Hey guys, what's up? MadSeason here, and welcome to part 1 of my Q&A series. This is a series where I answer your questions about pretty much anything World of Warcraft related. We got some really good questions for the first part of the series, which I'm very happy about, so sit back and enjoy. First, we have a question from my good friend John M. on Patreon. He asks what the best class is for a beginner World of Warcraft player in Legion, and what the best class is for someone who loves complexity and challenge. This is a good question. It's one that I get quite a lot, actually. Unfortunately, I haven't had a chance to play every spec in Legion, so my sample size is pretty low. The specs I've played are mainly DPS, with the ones in my class guide playlist being the most played. It is a pretty hard one to answer because there'll be some subjectiveness to it, and each class of course has 3 specs which vary in complexity and ease of use. So for this question, just because I haven't played every spec yet, I'll change it slightly to the best beginner or more complex spec rather than class. Like I said, this is very opinionated, but out of all of the specs I've played, I would have to say the one I had the easiest time with would be the Destruction Warlock, and the one I found to be the most difficult or complex to play would be the Survival Hunter. Allow me to explain why. For the Destruction Warlock, first off, just having a pet is a huge bonus for any beginner spec. Having a tank helps out a ton with some of the more challenging stuff. Not only that, but I found that there's really not a lot of complexity to this spec. We're now in the Soul Shard system as opposed to the Burning Ember system, which you can argue was more complex, and we only have 2 baseline Soul Shard generators, Immolate, which is our only dot, and Conflagrate. And for our Soul Shard spenders, not counting the tertiary stuff like Demon Summons, we only have 2 as baseline as well. Chaos Bolt for single target, and Rain of Fire for AoE. We also don't have anything proc-wise, which can sometimes be difficult for really new players to handle. So it's all very straightforward. I mean, just like with every spec, you can make it more in-depth and complicated depending on your talent choice and whatnot, but at its very basic core, I think Destruction Warlock is a really good choice for beginner players. As for the most complex spec, like I said, for me, it's the Survival Hunter. Now, I haven't played them much since I made that class guide, so I'm not sure if anything has changed, but personally, I had a really hard time trying to optimize everything with that spec. Once again, it depends on your talent choice, but you can have so many dots, cooldowns, and procs to manage with that spec, and keeping track of it all was pretty tough. For dots, we have Serpent Sting through Raptor Strike through Talents, Murder of Crows, Lacerate, Steel Trap, Explosive Trap. For cooldowns, you have Flanking Strike and Mongoose Bite. Mongoose Bite in particular has a system where the more you use it, the more powerful it'll be, so you really only want to use it when you have a decent amount of charges saved up. And to add on to that, our mastery is based off a proc from our pet's attacks, where they have a chance to give you another charge of Mongoose Bite. And to top all of that off, our artifact ability is also increased by the same buff that increases Mongoose Bite's damage, so you only want to use that when you have high stacks. Keeping track of all of this while trying to dodge boss mechanics at the same time makes for some pretty intense gameplay. And on that note, it's even tougher for Survival Hunters this expansion since we of course used to be a ranged class. In my experience in Legion, just like most expansions, melee specs typically have more stuff to dodge compared to range, so that's just another thing for you to handle. Once again, you can make a spec as easy or as hard as you want it to be. It all depends on your talent choice. You can definitely make things easier on yourself by choosing certain talents, but for the potential of being the most complex spec, for me it's Survival Hunter, hands down. But like I said, that's just my opinion. And remember, I haven't played every spec yet, so just keep that in mind. Next up, we have a question from Vlad C. He asks what my favorite mount is. This is a pretty tough question too since I like a lot of them, so I'll split it up between my favorite ground mount and flying mount. My favorite ground mount would have to be the Ultramarine Kiraji Battle Tank. This is the mount that you get from Archaeology, and the reason why it's my favorite, for one, it just looks cool in my opinion. It is a reskin of the old Ankiraj 40 mounts, but those are only usable inside of the instance, with the exception of course being the Black Kiraji Battle Tank, which you can only get during the opening event for AQ40 back in vanilla. Another reason why it's my favorite is just because how insanely time-consuming it was to get it back when it was first released. This was released back in Cataclysm along with the whole archaeology system, and the way you got it was through a faction called the Tol'vir. The issue with this was the Tol'vir dig sites were very rare to get because they were limited to one of the new Cataclysm zones, Uldum. This is on the Kalimdor continent, so it shares spawns with every other zone on that continent. And it's not only that, but actually getting it as a solve was also incredibly rare, so it was RNG on top of RNG. When Cataclysm first came out, I remember seeing the mount, and I knew I had to get it, so pretty much every day I would be flying around for 10 hours hunting down those dig sites. Yeah, I had a lot of free time back then. I remember being so excited when it finally showed up in my next solve, I flipped out. I wasn't actually the first on the server to get it though. Another guy beat me to it, but I do think I was second place, as far as I knew anyways. I think they made it way easier to get now. As far as I know, they made those Tol'vir sites pop up way more often, but back then it was insane. So if not for the actual look of this mount, it's my favorite, at least for that moment of finally getting it after weeks of trying. For my flying mount, nothing really comes to mind as a favorite. I like a lot of them. I guess if I had to pick one, it would be the X-53 touring rocket that you get from the Recruit a Friend bonus. This one, if you don't know, is a 2-seater flying mount, so it's really handy for flying people around, or if you just have 2 accounts like I used to have. I think it looks kinda neat too, so that definitely helps. Next up, we have another question, this one from a longtime viewer, Taters58. I'm sort of gonna lump 2 of the questions together since they're pretty relevant to each other. He/she asks, when did I start playing World of Warcraft, and what class did I play? I started playing World of Warcraft in March of 2005, so not at the beginning, but pretty early on. At the time I heard about it, I was playing my very first MMO and PC game, Star Wars Galaxies, which, by the way, is still one of my favorite games of all time, at least before they changed it anyways. The way I heard about it was all of my friends in that game were slowly quitting for this new blockbuster MMO. Everyone said it was amazing and that it was the best MMO out at the time, and that game was, of course, World of Warcraft. So I started playing it pretty much because I had no one else to play with in Star Wars Galaxies. I was the last one to jump ship out of that game. I never played a Warcraft game before then. I've never even heard of the series, in fact. The only reason I picked it up was because it was an MMO and all my friends were playing it pretty much. As for my first class, it's actually a funny story, although a bit long, so I hope it doesn't bore you. I believe my very first class was actually an undead mage. Now, one thing you have to keep in mind is, in Star Wars Galaxies, there was no magic. You only had classes, or what they called professions in that game, that had blasters or melee weapons for the most part, so this concept of magic was completely foreign to me. And I remember that my first character was a mage, and what I would do was go around whacking everything with my staff. Keep in mind, too, that this is when MMOs were still pretty brand new, at least for me. I didn't know I actually had a fireball to use, so I would just go around the starting area meleeing everything as a mage, so naturally things didn't turn out too well. Another thing to keep in mind is that this was vanilla World of Warcraft in early 2005, and things were not forgiving at all. So even in the starting area, I died over and over again, wondering what I was doing wrong, spending hours never making it past level 4 or whatever. While I was meleeing away, I remember seeing another player with a demon following him, so I thought that was the way to go. That's what I'm doing wrong, I gotta have pets do everything for me. In Star Wars Galaxy, some of you may remember that there was the creature handler profession, where you could tame pets and have them kill everything for you, so that's what my plan was. I managed to catch up to that guy and asked him how he got that pet, and he told me you had to be a warlock. So I made a warlock and proceeded to once again whack everything with my staff, because remember, you had to get to level 6 before you could get your imp, and that may as well have been on the moon for me at that point. I was going nowhere. So at this point, I'm pretty much ready to drop the game because I just could not figure out what I was doing wrong. But I did give it one last go. Both of the characters I made at this point were undead, so I thought maybe it's because I picked them. You know, they're all skin and bones, of course they won't do any damage. So I went through the character select screen and picked the beefiest, strongest, most Ronnie Coleman lookalike character I could find, and that was a male dwarf. Surprisingly not an orc or a tauren for some reason. I don't know, maybe I just wanted to distance myself from the undead race as much as possible, so I didn't even want to be on the same side. But luckily the class I picked this time was the Paladin, and they're supposed to melee everything, so I was finally successful. I finally got out of the starter area, and eventually I figured out I actually had abilities that I could use, and it just went on from there. So to finally answer that question, the first class I leveled to 60 was the Paladin. So that basically covers it. Hopefully I didn't bore you all too much by going off on a tangent, but it's fun for me to recollect on all of that stuff. I actually miss when I was so new to the game like that. I'm sure you guys were the same with your first MMO. Stepping into this ginormous world wide-eyed with zones upon zones to explore, a plethora of classes, enemies, professions, dungeons, raids, all that stuff. I think that feeling plays a big part in the popularity and the fondness that we always see for vanilla servers, or just when people recollect about vanilla. While it may be true that perhaps some aspects of the game were better, and there's nothing wrong with that if that's how you feel, but I think a lot of that stuff is part of the feeling of your very first experience playing an MMO. To me, it's an experience that I'll remember forever with great fondness, and it's one of the reasons why I consider this game to be among the best of the best.